Why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm glad you could join us this afternoon. It is afternoon on the East Coast at least, and I guess on the West Coast as well. For those in other time zones, forgive me, the East Coast centricness. Um, I'm Cliff Lynch. I'm the director of the Coalition for Networked Information, and I will be fairly briefly introducing the session. This is one of the synchronous project briefing sessions that we've scheduled for the spring 2021 CNI virtual member meeting. We had a number of these on Monday and Tuesday of this week, and there'll be two more at 4 p.m. Eastern on Thursday and Friday. I do want to just remind you that we are relying considerably more heavily than in the past on pre-recorded project briefings as well as synchronous project briefings. The pre-recorded briefings are available on demand, and we released the range of those recordings on Monday. I would invite you to take a look and enjoy those as your time and interest permits. Next week on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, we will be doing some plenary day sessions, and I hope you can join us for those as well. This session, like all of the other synchronous sessions at CNI, is being recorded, and we will make the recording publicly available after the meeting. Couple of mechanical things. There is a chat box, and please feel free to use that. There is a Q&A tool if you want to queue up questions for the panel, and you will also have other ways of engaging the panel, which they will tell you about later. There is a closed captioning transcript available, and please use that if it's helpful to you. I think that's all of the mechanics. I do want to just take a moment to very briefly introduce our speakers. Sara Rouhi from the Public Library of Science will be sort of moderating and leading this conversation, and she'll be joined by Greg Yu from the Center for Research Libraries and Maurice York from the Big Ten Academic Alliance. The topic here is one that feels very timely to me. It's about really what are the key objectives in publishers and libraries trying to work together and find the right kinds of mission alliance and alignment and mutual support structures for their work. And I think you'll hear some very interesting examples of that in this conversation. I want to note, though, that these kinds of conversations really are ongoing in many parts of our community. I mean, in a very real sense, much of the talk of transformative agreements relates very strongly to these kinds of discussions, as does the growing emphasis on library publishing programs coming at the issue from another side. So I think you'll find this conversation very interesting. And with this, I'm going to shut up, disappear, and turn it over to Sara. I'll just take one more moment to thank our speakers for joining us today. It's much appreciated, and thank you for visiting the session. Over to you, Sara.
Thanks so much, Cliff. And thanks so much to both you and Diane for, as usual, organizing a really interesting and thoughtful set of sessions for all of us today. And really nice to see so many familiar names on the attendee list. Maurice and I were joking, and Greg were joking before that we'd happily sit and listen to any of the people on the attendee list have this exact same talk. So our goal is really to just create a space today where you can join us in a conversation that the three of us have been having for some time, that I know we've been having with many of you who are watching right now, in sort of side conversations. So nothing new here, but I think a nice space to kind of have the conversation in a larger context. So the way we're going to structure the conversation today is each of us are going to briefly introduce ourselves. And again, I think it's really nice that many of us know each other already. And then we want to dive into an open conversation amongst the three of us that we hope all of you will participate in as the prompts kind of come up on the screen. So Diane's going to go ahead and basically give everyone the ability to unmute. And as you want to just jump in, interrupt, ask questions, vigorously debate, whatever's coming to mind, you'll all have the ability to do that. And if you don't feel comfortable with that more overt form of participation, feel free to throw things in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll try to MC the whole thing. But our goal here is not a conversation amongst ourselves, but a conversation with you. So with that, I'll let Maurice, you want to introduce yourself first?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Maurice York from the Big Ten Academic Alliance, and I'm the Director of Library Initiatives for the Big Ten Academic Alliance. I've been there since last May. And previous to that was at the University of Michigan. So I've been in the Big Ten for a long time, and have taken up sort of this central perspective of what can we do together as an alliance, collective action, and working for the common good. So great privilege to be here today and talking about this topic. Scholarly publishing, open knowledge, and open science is one of the central pillars of our strategic action together. So really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Maurice. Greg, how about you?
Sure. Well, I'm just delighted to be here today. I am speaking from downtown Chicago. I am the president of the Center for Research Libraries here in Chicago. And my interest in this topic really started when I was the associate director for collections at MIT. And at MIT, the MIT Press is part of the same administrative unit as the library. And the library certainly was concerned about its budget. The press was concerned about their revenue model. And I just saw so many opportunities for the library to work collaboratively with the university press at MIT, that now that I'm here at CRL, which has been building this collective collection and building collections collectively in the research library community, as collections are not just what we procure and purchase, but they're also increasingly what we subsidize and we produce. I'm really interested to see what CRL can do in that space to help the community create great content. So I think very, very interested in this topic.
Great. And my name is Sara Rouhi. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at PLOS. I came to PLOS about 2 years ago, given the remit to help us start thinking about diversifying revenue streams and business models that would situate us well for the kind of paradigm, the big paradigm shift we're all in the midst of right now, particularly with an eye to equity and ensuring that our business models were aligning with our mission. And one of the reasons I was really keen to get just to have this conversation, and it's a conversation I've been having with many of you as well who are attending, is that kind of where the intersection of mission alignment and partnership happens. When I first reached out to Maurice about partnering in 2019, you know, Maurice, you weren't there. You weren't there yet. So it was before Maurice came. Rob was holding down the fort, and I was thinking, Big Ten, like these schools are never going to coordinate. Like there's no way. There's too many, you know, giant research institutions. Where is a place of alignment? And in trying to discuss what PLOS was trying to do in this case with our collective action model, which is the agreement that we moved forward with Maurice, it became clear, oh, Maurice has a thing he's trying to get he's trying to get the group to do. And so alignment made sense in terms of both where both organizations' missions were going. And this is exactly the conversation we're having with Greg. This is a conversation we're having with Daniel at Yale, with Robin at JHU. So with many of you already. And it piqued this question in me, which is, why are certain libraries keen to partner when a place like PLOS is asking for new money, asking you to go out on a limb and try something new, asking you to make a bet on a different kind of model that other people aren't doing? Why is that happening? And that was kind of the genesis for wanting to have this conversation. So with that, throwing these questions really out to everybody on the call, feel free to unmute or jump into the chat if you want to make a comment or a question. But I'll just throw this both out then to Maurice and to Greg. How is the current crisis informing your thinking on the role that your organizations are playing? Oops, sorry, I keep doing that.
Maurice, do you want to go ahead?
I'll jump in real quick. This question of how we bring equity and sustainability to the scholarly publishing environment, to forward open science, to forward open knowledge. I mean, this has been really a global movement for 20 years to say, how do we move towards open knowledge? And the business models put in place and that we have right now, that work with things like article processing charges, that work with other ways that have been developed over the last 20 years, have served well to move towards open knowledge. We can see that just looking at the global trends over the last 20 years. So within the Big Ten, for instance, among our 15 research libraries, fully half of the content that is published now is open. The question is that the kind of open that we want, right? Is it the accessibility to knowledge what we want? Does it suit the way that we do scholarship and what we'd like to see in a sustainable open knowledge ecosystem going forward? And what the pandemic did, as it did with so many conversations, was it just rapidly accelerate both the urgency, the need. We could look at a number of the different elements that the pandemic brought to the fore. I mean, cost is clearly one of those, right? So the constraints on our budgets, the constraints on both institutional as well as library budgets and things like that. But there's many others as well, and we could perhaps dive into the different aspects of that. But the current crisis just asks us to, I think, calls us to action, to say, we must act now in order to find the proper models, both the business models as well as the models for open scholarship that are going to sustain us into the future. And what is happening right now is just dramatic shifts. Just to mention a couple of questions that come to the fore with the pandemic. Did research and publishing output go up, or did it go down? Right? We're just starting to get some of the data around that and to see it. But the current question, I think, calls forward is, what are the right models to move forward with? And there's lots of good thinking on this, lots of good perspectives, but nobody's figured it out, right? And so that's where I think I'm coming from, and the Big Ten is really motivated towards, is let's start to seed experiments. Let's try to find the ways, given the current context, given what we've all been trying to work for a very long time, to try and find those sustainable models for open knowledge. And what is happening all around us right now, what we're living through, kind of calls forward the urgency of that moment to find those and to really seed at scale what we can do to transform the way that scholarly communication is working.
So, that's such a great answer, Maurice. And, like many of you, like all of you, I've been doing a lot of reflection over the last year and a half on crisis and what is crisis. And, leading, CRL over the last year through COVID, I've had to shut down a building, partially reopen a building, apply for CARES Act to avoid staff furloughs. We're all wrestling with racial reckoning and campaigns for racial justice, and fighting against systemic racism. So, like everyone, I've been really thinking about crisis and what's the nature of crisis. And as I've been doing this thinking over the last year, I realized that I'm probably about halfway, through my career. I've never had a moment in my career that hasn't been defined by crisis. I'm a historian by training. My whole career, 20 years plus, is played out in the background of the crisis in the humanities. As a librarian, my entire career has played out in the Scalcom crisis and the serials crisis. And over the last year, as I've been thinking about a real immediate crisis that will have a beginning and an end, COVID will end. I think we see the ending in sight. I've been really thinking back on my use and framing of crisis when it comes to my work as a librarian and as an historian. And I realized that those aren't crisis. I actually see that more as condition. And the condition I see it is really one of post-coloniality. When I think of the breakdown of the monograph publishing system, when I see questioning models of how journals are being published, those are all units. Those are all units, institutional models, business models that have been framed by Western European modernity. It's a modernity project. And so as we're in a post-colonial space and we're all trying to navigate a post-colonial space, which is not just theoretical, it's temporally and geographically time-bound, as we're all trying to navigate this post-colonial condition, of course it makes sense that disciplinary boundaries are being problematized. Of course business models are being disrupted. Of course, there are all of these stresses and strains in our knowledge institutions. And then I'm like, and I start thinking about this condition of post-coloniality, and I think, all right, well, how do we navigate this and move forward? It seems to me that with this topic, by centering professional values and mission, being committed to research-based knowledge production, academic publishing, when you really get down to first principles and values, then you really can start to define who's your community. And mission-driven publishers and mission-driven, scholarly societies and mission-driven research libraries, we're all part of the same community that dedicated to research-based knowledge production. And so redefining those institutional boundaries between mission-driven publisher, research library, author, those professional boundaries and institutional boundaries are all problematized right now. But I think it's more than any single crisis. I think this is part of a condition of post-coloniality. And I think that is a framing that can be super generative and powerful. So that's what I've been thinking about. As I navigate a real crisis, I think I have a new perspective on the old crisis.
That's a really helpful framing to bring your framing helps just with my thinking around this. Prior to 2020, I was definitely not engaged in these questions in the way that I am now. So it's interesting how the past year has kind of forced everyone to have a sort of personal reckoning with themselves about how they engage with these questions. And certainly at PLOS, there's been a real sort of period of self-reflection at the executive level about what are we trying to do as an organization and where are we underscoring systems of inequity that we don't intentionally want to undergird, but by virtue of being born a certain way, we can't help but do, given the way that we've historically done business. And so, depending on who you talk to, when I sort of speak to the work that we're doing around models, being predicated on equity and social justice, depending on who you talk to, there's, various levels of eye rolling. But there is there's some deep work we're trying to do to understand what are the things that we've taken as a given that are really holdovers from a kind of like academic colonialism or academic imperialism that really does need to be problematized the way that you're talking about. So I was participating research, I think, was it R2R was like just last month, research to research conference. Again, time is a flat circle, so I've sort of lost track when all these things were happening. But we were doing a session there on kind of the gatekeepers of knowledge, right? And just the fact that there's a very small sort of elite group of institutions and stakeholders who hand out money to do research, right? Who deem what research is worthy and what research is not, what research should have a platform and be funded and be supported, and what shouldn't be. And how much time are any of us really spending to unpick, well, why is it that way? And why do we keep funding this and not that? And why are we privileging certain forms of knowledge over others? And how much of that unpicking can you do before it sort of becomes untenable? So there's a tension there that we're trying to address on a sort of philosophical level, and then we're also trying to practically apply it in the work that we do. And there's obviously tons of work to do there, but that's kind of what the pandemic has forced us sort of on a personal and professional plane to consider. Tara had just a comment. Tara, if you want to unmute yourself or raise your hand, just say so in the chat, that you were exploring movement in a certain direction, but I missed what part of the conversation you typed this in, so I'm not sure what direction you meant. So if you want to unmute yourself to kind of jump in on that, that would be helpful. Questions to Greg and to Maurice, and this might be different for both of you, but what kind of change management has this strategy required on your end? Are your groups, are your organizations so aligned that it was more of oh, there's a question. I'll stop then. Let me Dale, if you want to go ahead, I'll come back to my question.
Yeah, sure. I wasn't sure how this is going to work, so I just put my hand up.
We're just guessing as we go here. So
perfect. No, I like the experimentation. Clearly I came to the right room today. If we were in a hotel room, I would be sitting in the back thinking, good choice, good choice.
Good.
Just for some context, so at the University of Alberta, the press is part of my portfolio and actually is functionally part of the library, but it operates sort of somewhat separately within the library. So we have a I'll call it a fairly traditional university press. The library also has an activity that we give the elegant name of library publishing to, where we have a list of about 70 journals and have been doing that for over a decade, pretty consistently. So my big concern, and to these questions you're asking, and to the questions of what, Greg's question earlier about what can CRL do, I may have a partial challenge for that, which is, I'm thinking a lot these days about what we can sustain from the institutional side in terms of of course, the investment. We're all worried about what we spend on this. That's the crisis, to which Greg was referring. But also, what can we sustain in terms of work levels? What are we going to recreate if we create 1,000 little bespoke arrangements that we then have to maintain? So just to bring this to a point, I got an email the other day from a colleague in Canada who's the editor of a journal in the library and information science space, and they want to build a sustainable business model for an open access publication. And they said, the survey was basically asking, is your institution willing to pay I think they called it a sponsorship, although they asked us what they should call it too, which I thought was interesting, to help them hit a target where they could sustain their journal. And I felt a bit odd because despite being fully supportive of open access, I said no to all of their questions and said, no, we're not willing to do that. Because if we go back down the road of creating what would it functionally from a labor perspective be like subscribing to 1,000 society journals and maintaining these one-to-one relationships for small journals, we can't sustain that from a labor perspective. We are not funded at a level to have that level of staffing that we can maintain that. Plus, it's kind of a nightmare in modern financial systems to do it that way. So what I was thinking as I was filling that out is that we need scaled models, and we have some of this, parts and bits and pieces of it, where journals that want to do this can be part of a larger group that's preferably not a publisher that can do this for them. So we as institutions could give money to an institution who can then give it to journals. And what I see there coming, and this is a long comment, I apologize, I'll bring it to a point, is that we get the benefit of scale as an institution because we don't have to have 1,000 small relationships with 1,000 small vendors in our financial systems. We can't do that. But it also would maybe perhaps also assure that the subsidies journals would be getting, or the sponsorships, whatever you want to call them, would be tied to, I want to say, almost performance metrics, that those journals are operating as efficiently as possible, that they are getting what they need, but not funding opulent business models or funding other purposes. You know, societies use the journals to sort of fund other operations. No, I want to fund journals. So I think there could be guarantees in both directions and benefits of scale in both directions. And I've seen some of these models that work in places, but there are others where they haven't necessarily had the benefits of making things sustainably open access that we might have wanted. So I think there's room in this space for scaled action. I just don't know who controls it and how we put sort of quality and integral control on it.
I have so many thoughts, but I've talked too much already, so I want to let someone else go.
Dale, there's so much good stuff embedded in the comments you made there, and just to maybe pick up a couple, and we'll probably move between a lot of these as we go in the conversation. But like Greg, to tie back to the very good framing you were making about the post-colonial condition that we're moving through. And I think, Dale, this is exactly part of it, is we have to bring great intention to how we design these business models and how we create the sustainable ecosystem that we want to see, and that we don't accidentally fall back into models of the past or think we're going in a new direction and accidentally fall back into old models that are really not what we wanted to see, not just in terms of the economic sustainability, but that don't follow our intention to bring equity and principles of social justice and inclusion to the kind of scholarship we're creating. There's this, and Spark has done just outstanding research on this, just the gross inequity between the global north and the global south, and the voices that get heard and who gets published and what research emerges, right? And as we are creating a more open and sustainable ecosystem, to slip back into some of the things that have brought about the current condition, you know, accidentally would be, it would not only be very sad, but would be grossly unjust, right? And we have to be able to have these exact kind of conversations so that we can create not just the economic sustainability, but the kind of scholarship that we want to see, the kind that has the kind of equity that we want to see, that's opening up new kinds of opportunities and including new voices that simply have been suppressed or just not present in the current ecosystem of academic publishing.
Yeah, and Dale, to build on your point, you know, one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be in this conversation, representing CRL, being on this conversation, you know, talking with, you know, Sara at PLOS and talking with Maurice. Maurice and I have just been having a ball having these wonderful conversations about how ways that, you know, CRL and the Big Ten can work together. And this is what I'm thinking about. When I look at the consortial space, when I look at libraries working together at that network level, I think that there is a lot of opportunity to rationalize that space. And so CRL being a national organization or binational with, you know, across Canada and the US, I want CRL to do what CRL can uniquely do and no more. And I wanted to help Big Ten do what Big Ten can uniquely do. And really creating these wonderful, more rational partnerships, aligning consortia to consortia will be really, really helpful. And the other thing I think that we can do, CRL, Big Ten, otherwise, is really serving as a platform to align workflows, not just budgets, but workflows. The work of liaison librarians and the work of acquisition editors in a journal, these skill sets map very, very, very well together. There are opportunities to start sharing staff and really start combining workflows. I think those are huge opportunities. And right now that's a real gap because library workflows are designed to buy. So if you're going to sell something to us, we are optimized to procure it. We negotiate hard. We're procurement systems. We're procurement machines at scale. But when you change the model and you're like, all right, well, now you're partnering with a mission-aligned organization, and it's not about, you know, driving the hardest bargain. right? You're not negotiating with Elsevier, Sage, Wiley, or commercial publisher. You're actually working with a colleague in the academic research enterprise. Well, then you're trying to serve as a patron to support that model. So I think that using our consortial arrangements and aligning things at the level of workflow and budgets is a real path forward to end that all the churn and confusion and unintentional overlap that I think you're referencing, Dale. I think there's an opportunity, well, a need to rationalize the ecosystem.
Boyan had a great question that I wanted to tag onto this that she raised earlier. She asks, and Boyan, if you want to unmute, please feel free. What do you have in mind as different modes of knowledge production in constraint to what you call post-colonial? Can you say a bit more if you have thoughts on alternative different varieties of knowledge production and how they relate to libraries?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump right in, and this is a topic that I'm really excited about, and I want to explore more fully. But so of course there's indigenous knowledge, situated knowledge, and centering that in knowledge production frameworks. It's also adopting a different posture with colleagues in the global South. The open access problem is not one of just removing barriers to reading research produced by the global North. It's about giving voice and learning from the knowledge production from scholars in the global South and elsewhere. But here's something that's really interesting about the post-colonial framework, right? Because we could talk about it in terms of global North, global South. We can do that. But another interesting flip on it is you could actually look at it and look at Western Europe, right? And you say, well, let's look at a pre-colonial Western Europe. And so if you look at knowledge production in early modern Europe, or before the rise of printed books or whatnot. If you look at the work of Anthony Grafton, you saw these book production industries where scholars and academic publishers and libraries were all working cheek by jowl in the same administrative space. So it's interesting. Taking a post-colonial framework actually allows us to appreciate some models in Western European knowledge production that have been obfuscated by the modernity project. So I think that the post-colonial framing is actually incredibly generative.
Sorry, I'm trying to tweet as we go here. Other comments or questions from the audience so far?
I think Carl had a comment.
Oh, Carl, please.
He's put it in the chat there. He writes, relating to DEI and openness, the question of how we redefine authority and how we establish it is foundational.
Absolutely. And the challenge that I've found here is sort of how do you shift that conversation? And maybe that relates a bit to the question of, what are the priorities of your member libraries? And also that question of change management. It's really interesting, when I go to what I would consider an activist consortium or library, there's an I try to be as transparent as I can about PLOS's priorities, what we can do, what we can't do, our financial constraints, where we're trying to go strategically. And usually, because it's an activist library, right, there's already, we identify alignment really quickly. And then it's just about, as Greg said, just figuring out how do we co-create in a way that, as many people win as possible. And there's nothing adversarial about that engagement. For libraries that aren't in that headspace, which is more of them than not, it's really interesting how, and this is decades of trauma given, historically how the cereals crisis has gone, right? But there'll just instantly be a shift to show me a price and show me a discount. And I'll be like, wait, no, I don't want to start the conversation there. I want to start the conversation kind of with what we can achieve together. And it's bridging that gap can be a really big gap. And so I want to pose that question to both of you in terms of how does what kind of change management is required to sort of get everyone moving in the same direction? I mean, Maurice, the decision to get, 15 institutions of that size and magnitude to act together is like not a small feat. What was that like in terms of that process? And I know you have, members on the call here. So if folks want to speak to that, I'd be really interested to hear.
Yeah, it's a great question, and tie threads from a couple of the really good comments and questions that I had so far as well. One of the things for the Big Ten Academic Alliance that it has going for it is over 60 years of building trust networks and successful collaboration. It's not just the libraries of the Big Ten, it's all academic, it is a wide variety of academic and research programs across the universities. And the libraries fit into that landscape as a key part of the activity. So it's closely mission, and we're talking about mission alignment, closely mission aligned to the missions of the universities, to the reason that the Alliance was created over 60 years ago, and forwarding the scholarship and research of the universities as a whole. So the sort of change management and getting everyone to act to the libraries to move together in this direction is about the record of success that we have so far and the strength that we've built. So there was a moment in the fall of 2019 when all 15 of the library directors signed a sheet of paper that said, we are committed to an interdependent future. We are committed to linking the futures of our organizations together deeply to serve the academic mission of our universities. So then what we're in now is a long process of, I mean, this is putting feet on the ground, right? Putting wheels on the ground, figuring out what this looks like to say, how do we bring that into action, right? That's an incredible momentous commitment to make. How do we live that, and how do we bring it into action? And the answer in this field, as in many others, is that models exist out there. The pieces and parts that we want to see exist, but we can't pick anything. There's nothing we can pick up wholesale and say, oh, that's exactly what we want to do. Just put that, economic model in place, put that system in place, put this, workflow, right, in place, and we're done. It's about seeding experiments, seeding pilot projects, seeing what works and what doesn't, and then deepen the investment on what works. And that is going to be a dynamic process. Change is change, right? And it's challenging. But that is basically the method we put in place as an innovation model to move forward. And this is exploratory as much in the scholarly communication space and in journal publishing and in partnerships as it is in many other spaces that we need to work forward in. So, and working in partnership with publishers, I think, is absolutely essential here, right? There is too much of a momentum towards being on one side or the other of being the buyer or the seller, or, this is not an economic, I mean, there's an economic part of it that's incredibly important, but the challenge of how we reimagine it and what we create together is the exploratory field, right? And we need the partnerships and the conversations to move back and forth and say, what should this look like? How should we approach it? So as Dale, as you were asking, that we don't accidentally fall into old patterns or things that we've learned are really not where we want to be. There's a lot that we can observe that is wrong with the current system, and we don't want to accidentally recreate that. So it's a process of constant analysis, constant learning. And Dale, one of the other questions you brought up is about the point of metrics, or about observing how, say, for a journal publisher or for an individual journal, or for how a society is using a journal, for example. Just wanted to point really quickly to the Humetrics project. And if you Google Humetrics HSS, which is basically saying, how do we reimagine a metric system based in values, rather than just economic metrics or, KPIs or however that may exist right now, and things like equity, in openness, in collegiality, soundness and community are their 5 principles. Thanks, Sarah, for that, putting that link in there. And bringing those very human values, those human goals, and which are the goals fundamentally of the academy, of how we want to work with knowledge into the center of what we're doing, is absolutely essential. And that's how we're going to work properly with change, and holding these values and these goals in front of us constantly, right? We can never let them become hidden. We have to always bring them to the fore and keep them constantly in view.
Greg, I want you to take a stab at what I think Monica and Tara are trying to synthesize. And we've been commenting in the chat that they're kind of on the same wavelength. And it reminds me, the questions that they're both raising kind of remind me of the kind of approach we're having in a lot of discussions around climate change. But we'll keep it in the context of, Greg, how your historical framing around the sort of the post-coloniality that we're trying to walk through here. And then Tara's concern that both Tara and Monica's comments are really speaking to this feeling of like, it really feels like a big lift, right? Like undoing centuries of ingrained structures of oppression is really overwhelming, and something I think we all want to commit to in principle. But when the rubber hits the road and I open my desktop every day and look into my email, I'm not sure how to translate the kind of work that I do day to day to unpacking that piece. So there's that. And then so that's kind of the macro. And then Tara takes Monica's point and kind of, I think gets a little more detailed in the question of, particularly when it comes to thinking about how libraries can use their power to inform and make and change the paradigm we're working in. It can feel really hard because you've got these, capitalist imperatives driving how you decide, questions about budget, whilst knowing that if we worked as collectives, we could probably achieve a bit more, but those two things are really at tension. So if I were to drill all of that down, there's a sense of how do you deal with it feels like such a big lift on both sides, and what are iterative ways to start hacking away at this where you feel like you're making progress, but you're not trying to put your arms around the entire iceberg?
Sure, that's a great question. Well, I think that the appreciating the stresses of research-based knowledge production as a condition rather than a crisis is helpful, because it's not a crisis that we're gonna, with a beginning and an end, it's something we're gonna solve. These are institutional frameworks that will evolve organically over time. And so the challenge before us isn't to solve the crisis. The challenge is to center our values and our first principles and to make progress, move the needle on our institutional frameworks and our staffing models and our workflows, and just move things in the right direction. And I think what feels like progress to me is rethinking the professional boundaries that we've inherited, rethinking the institutional frameworks that we've inherited, publisher, library, scholarly society, and really being willing to reframe them in a way so so that those of us that inhabit different parts of the academic publishing ecosystem can work more fruitfully together. One of the most challenging things for me, say, just to boil it down to an example, when I was at MIT, I was stewarding a collections budget, and we were really concerned about how do we use this collection budget to best effect. And then I would go to the MIT Press, again, part of the same organization. I served on the editorial board, and we're really thinking about, well, what kind of revenue model is going to allow us to continue to produce really high quality scholarship, right? And because the workflows weren't dialed in, with different fund management systems, different staffing models, staff oftentimes didn't even know each other. For the MIT Press to produce content, they would contemplate using a jobber, a vendor that would take a percentage up front and then come across campus and sell the content to the library, right? And so that's an example of the institutional frameworks that we've inherited, needing to rethink those, right? And so I used to often say, here's a metric for the Stalcom crisis. If you're a research librarian and you steward a collections budget, Raise your hand if you have a personal relationship with a vendor from a commercial publisher, right? I think most of us would raise our hand. And then I would say, well, raise your hand if you have a personal relationship with a staff member of a university press. I'm guessing a lot of those hands would go down, right? So moving the needle forward for me is to bring different parts of the research-based, knowledge production framework together in new ways. And so that brings us back to this topic here. How can research libraries partner with mission-driven publishers in new ways? And not, that's the problem before us. Oh, and one thing I'll say, because I didn't answer Monica's question, this is a perfect example where Monica, I'd like to hear her answer that question. Monica, I have here, just as luck has it, propping up my laptop, this book here, which I think is probably one of the most brilliant expositions on framing what colonialism is. It's the Frederick Cooper book, Colonialism in Question. This book exists because Monica McCormick. So Monica, you tell me what we should do with the post-colonial model. I'm not going to answer that.
Sorry, my inner Derrida fan is getting excited by that book. I'm sort of making a mental note of that text. Yeah, Diane, I don't know. Can you unmute Monica? There might be a ding thing.
I just got that. Well, I'm touched because that may be among the top 5 books I'm most proud to have ever published, because Fred Cooper is like, a god to me. But I don't know. I mean, I think having worked as a history editor for many years before I became a librarian, I really think about the way these things developed, and that, that little example from Anthony Grafton is a great example. It's like, we're not in that moment anymore. We've developed deep structural ways of working that have good reasons and important, it goes way beyond, the funds we use and the technologies we use. It's like, these are professional identity. There's just a lot at stake for people in changing these things. So I think for me to sit here as a library manager and think, okay, this institution took 400 years to develop, and I'm trying to change it in my own career time or in the next 10 years or whatever it is, it just feels a little bit, it's just overwhelming. So the stuff Maurice was talking about a few minutes ago, how do we hold in our minds those big essential questions, even as we go through our email every day? I mean, I think that's really the painful struggle, because it just feels, the other thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is we keep using the metaphor of an ecosystem, and things are going to evolve, and I feel like that's a very, very slow process, for one thing, and it's also one that humans aren't doing, right? This is a social, political, policy. These are human issues that humans have to resolve. I'm not leaving this to nature, right? We've got to make these choices. We've got to make these decisions. So for me, the ecosystem isn't, it's the society. It's the choices we're going to make as human beings and where we're going to put our time and our money. It's not natural selection. And I realize ecosystem can mean a lot of things, but I don't want it to be left to biology. This is a human problem.
No, Monica, I'm really glad you flagged that, because yeah, it's tempting to say like the system will always right itself. And so, I can wait for that to happen. And I know that's not what you mean. I don't think that's what any of us mean, but I appreciate your flagging the flip side of that metaphor. One of the things that really helps me when I'm thinking about this particular question that you're asking is, how do I take a bite out of the iceberg whilst not going crazy, having kids running around at home because school's not open and we're in a pandemic, and someone I know a loved one is sick with COVID, and someone I know has died from COVID. Like, you're doing all that and like tackling 400 years of systemic like that's a lot. So how do you sort of make it something that's manageable? And the approach that I've been empowered to take at PLOS, which I'm very grateful for, is one of iterative, small experimentation. Where is a place where I know I have a dedicated amount of money, time, resources, partnerships, collaborations, whatever that that thing is, that I know I have the ability to go and find Maurice or find Greg and say, it's not a lot, but I have this little sphere that I can do what I want with and work with you to do what you want. Can we find something, knowing that these are the principles I hang above my computer every day? Can we do something aligned with that? And so in a way, as you're navigating the kind of madness that we're all in right now, you know that I have at least one space that I have dedicated to starting chipping away at what feels like a very, very, very big set of questions and issues. And that's personally, and that's what I've done. And that's what PLOS has really, that's the approach that we've taken as a way to start addressing this. So, you know, Daniel might still be on the call when we announced the partnership with Yale, and people were like on Twitter, well, that's nice for Yale. You know, Yale's rich. Of course they can come up with a deal. And I was like, you know, I would tweet direct. I mean, I was happy to engage with people to explain, you know, we have to start somewhere. We have to start small. And frankly, when rich institutions are willing to go out on a limb and try something new, it gives us the space to start working with institutions that have a different set of circumstances, right? So it even just the snarky tweets opened an opportunity to have an engagement that made people sort of step back and think. So that was a very long way of saying, I don't think it's that, but we can maintain both at the same time, but I think we're also allowed to encase them in a space that feels manageable. There's a lot of comments. Let me see what's going on here.
Oh, while you're looking through that, Sarah, there's just one other thing I'd like to sort of bring forward in the conversation is that there's, as we seek to bring intention to do this, to transform the ecosystem, the landscape that's in front of us, there is an equal relationship between the content, between the research that is produced and the knowledge and the infrastructure that it sits in. And one of the things that is incredibly exciting and encouraging to me is the global communities working in both of these areas to say, how do we approach this and hold these equally? That if we want to have open and public knowledge and open content, we need to have open infrastructure as well, and ask deep questions about who built these systems? What were they built for? You know, why were they built? And maybe, definitely we need to have the open infrastructure and the systems, the repositories. There's a number of ways to do it, the software, the technology that holds and supports the knowledge that we're creating in a sustainable way. For it is knowledge for the future, not just knowledge for now as a monetized thing to sell. And it's communities like, you know, the Invest in Open Infrastructure community, like SCOS, like the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative out of Curtin University in Australia, that are picking up these questions and saying we need to call together a community to figure out the relationships between these and how we understand them and how we bring attention to what we're creating. And that's a really important dimension so that we don't accidentally end up creating the, you know, open knowledge that we want to see, but it's in completely proprietary and closed systems. And then we start asking questions like, well, who controls the knowledge? Who decides who sees what, right? And on what terms, you know, so that the aspects of the terms and the licensing and the access and the infrastructure are of equal importance if we're really going to change how, what we see and what we would like to create.
Just to tag on to that, Rosalind made a comment in the comments that I think really are another way of chipping at this iceberg that plus Greg and Monica's reading materials, I think are very relevant here. There's a tremendous amount of education we need to do ourselves, right? There's a tremendous amount of learning that I certainly had never started to do prior to the discussions around social justice right now, that I think will bring a lot of perspective when we start to examine with new eyes the structures that we're supporting through the systems we buy into, the collections we purchase, the systems we're building ourselves. So I really appreciate Monica sharing, well, Greg and Monica sharing the book, and then Rosalind sharing that particular article from all of the New York Times work that's been going on here, because it's just knowing that framing gives you a different lens when you're looking at what may feel like very quotidian decisions that we make every day, like, do I renew with this platform vendor or do I renew with this one? So I really appreciate your flagging that, Rosalind. Heather's got a question. thoughts on the challenges around preserving knowledge. So we've been talking about creating it and accessing it. Thoughts around dynamic content, web content, digital humanities. How can we cooperate to do a more efficient and thoughtful job in this? Thanks for that question, Heather.
Yeah, so I'll jump in because Heather's question really highlights the need to rethink how we build collections and how collection budgets and how collection staffing and operations run within research libraries. Like I said before, oftentimes our collection budgets and our related workflows are designed to optimize procurement. We buy things. So if publishers are going to sell things to libraries, boy, we are super efficient at buying it. We can do big deals. We can do approval plans for books. We are optimized to buy. Then you throw in something like, hey, that website, shouldn't we be archiving that? What's the web archiving? What's the collection development policy for that? What's the acquisition department policy for that? What's the preservation policy for that locally? What's the consortial collection development method for web archiving? Don't know how to do that so well yet, right? But if something is sold to us, boy, we can buy in bulk and we have that automated. So the challenge before us is rethinking, well, how is our collection budget designed? How are selectors trained? What would collection development look like if the new stacks is just a series of open repositories? And who's selecting content and who's putting content on those repositories, right? So I think that's what we need to rethink, and that's what we are rethinking. We've been rethinking this for decades now, and we're moving forward. But Heather's question really brings to the fore this idea that collection building and stewardship and dissemination is and must be much more than just procurement.
So we're coming to time. Diane flagged that I'm certainly more than willing to stay on after the recording stops at the top of the hour to continue this conversation. I feel like this is a case where you'd be sitting in a hotel lobby, you'd have a drink, you'd be eating some food, and then we'd all wander to dinner somewhere together. Since we can't do that, I'm more than happy to stick around. I don't want to speak for Greg and Morris, though. I want to make sure if you're unable to stay, no pressure if anyone can't stay. Are you two able to stay a little longer?
I could stay a little bit longer, yes.
Yeah, I'm good. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we can do another 10 or 15. But that's, yeah, Heather, if you want to follow up on that, please feel free. And for those of you that have to head out, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. This was exactly the kind of conversation I was hoping we'd have. So I'm delighted. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much to our panelists too. This has been a really tremendous conversation. Thanks for everyone who chimed in and who joined us. As Cliff said, we'll resume our CNI synchronous live sessions tomorrow afternoon, 4 p.m. Eastern time, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much, everybody. Just stick around if you want to keep the conversation going.